The stars twinkled in the distance as the peaceful alien world of Zarathos continued its calm existence. Its inhabitants, the Dracarians, were a proud and ancient species who had ruled over their corner of the galaxy for thousands of years. They were strong, intelligent, and had technology far beyond anything Earth had ever seen. The Dracarians had always been sure of one thing. They were the most advanced species in the universe. They believed no one could challenge their power or their place in the cosmos. For centuries, they had met other species, conquered and manipulated them, always knowing they were the top of the food chain. Humans, in their eyes, were just another primitive species, far beneath them. That was until Captain Ethan Blake arrived on their planet. The humans had sent Ethan on a diplomatic mission to Zarathos to open trade relations with the Dracarians. He was a calm, collected man, in his late 30s, with dark hair and sharp blue eyes. He had been selected because of his reputation for keeping his cool in difficult situations. The Dracarians had heard of humans before, but they had never met one in person. They had assumed humans were a young, struggling race, barely out of their planet's atmosphere, with no chance of becoming a true galactic power. The Dracarians didn't even bother to look up at the small human ship as it landed. It was a quiet affair. The ship was old, a model that had been in use for years, nothing like the sleek and powerful ships the Dracarians used. They watched with quiet amusement as Ethan stepped out, wearing a simple uniform and carrying only a few bags with him. The Dracarians greeted him with cold politeness, their leader, Zorath, stepping forward with a forced smile. "Welcome to Zarathos, human," he said, his voice smooth, as if trying to sound welcoming. But it was clear he didn't expect much from this meeting. "We've been expecting you." Ethan smiled and extended his hand in greeting. "Thank you, Zorath. It's an honor to be here," he said, his voice calm and polite. But his blue eyes scanned the surroundings, taking in everything. He wasn't a fool, and he could sense that the Dracarians weren't exactly thrilled by his presence. The Dracarians didn't show it, but they were already making assumptions about Ethan. They thought humans were weak. Their history was filled with war, disease, and destruction. It was hard for the Dracarians to see any potential in them. To them, humans seemed like a species just barely managing to survive. Their ships were nothing compared to the Dracarians' advanced fleet. Their technology was primitive at best. They didn't even have shields or weapons that could stand up to a Dracarian battle cruiser. As Ethan followed Zorath through the streets of Zarathos, he couldn't help but notice how strange the place looked. The architecture was impressive, towering buildings that shimmered in the sun with alien patterns, but there was an emptiness about it. The people moved in a slow, mechanical way, like they had seen everything before, and nothing could surprise them anymore. He was being shown the best parts of their city, but Ethan knew he was only seeing what they wanted him to see. It didn't matter. His mission was simple: establish a trade deal and keep the peace. That was all. The Dracarians offered Ethan food in a grand hall, where he sat at a long table filled with dishes that looked unfamiliar. He tried to be polite, taking small bites of the food, but it was obvious that the Dracarians weren't interested in making him feel comfortable. They were testing him, seeing how far they could push without getting a reaction. The food was strange, to say the least, and the atmosphere was uncomfortable. The Dracarians laughed at each other's jokes, but it was a cold laughter, a laughter that didn't quite reach their eyes. It was clear they weren't used to someone like Ethan, someone who didn't engage in their jokes or play along with their mockery. "You know," one of the Dracarians, Vorik, said with a smug grin, "we've heard much about humans. You barely made it to space, yet you've somehow managed to keep surviving. Tell us, how does your species handle such primitive technology? Is it really just sheer will that keeps you alive?" The comment was sharp, meant to belittle. The Dracarians were testing Ethan, seeing how far they could push. They assumed he'd get defensive or angry. Instead, Ethan kept his composure. He smiled politely, but his blue eyes glimmered with something deeper, something they couldn't understand. "We've learned to make the best of what we have," Ethan said calmly. "Sometimes, it's not about the tools you have, but how you use them." The Dracarians chuckled, not fully understanding his words, thinking he was simply trying to mask his weakness. They continued with their mockery. Another alien raised a glass and made a toast. "To humanity," Zoreth said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "May you continue to stumble through the stars." Ethan took a long sip from his glass, his hand steady, his face calm. He didn't show any sign of discomfort. But inside, something shifted. He had heard the jokes before, the insults about Earth and humans. He had heard them on countless worlds, from countless species. They thought they could laugh at humanity because they didn't truly understand. They didn't know the power that lay beneath the surface of human strength. They didn't know what humans were capable of when they finally decided to fight back. As the night went on, Ethan could feel the Dracarians growing confidence. They believed they had won. They had seen what they wanted to see. A peaceful human, easy to manipulate. But Ethan knew something they didn't. He knew what was coming. For now, he stayed calm, held his tongue, and kept his emotions in check. He had to. He had been trained to handle situations like this. He couldn't let them see that they were starting to get under his skin. But deep inside, he understood one thing. Humans weren't like any other species in the galaxy. When the time came, they wouldn't just roll over and take insults. They didn't fear losing. Humans had something more valuable than advanced technology. They had the will to survive, the ability to adapt, and the strength to overcome any challenge. And soon, the Dracarians would learn exactly why every species in the universe feared humans. As the days passed on Zarathos, the calm that had initially surrounded Captain Ethan Blake began to shift. He had expected some level of tension, but nothing prepared him for the constant barrage of subtle mockery and disdain the Dracarians aimed at him. They were testing him, pushing him, trying to provoke a reaction that would expose his weaknesses. Every word, every glance, every joke was designed to remind him of Earth's perceived inferiority. And yet Ethan remained composed, unwavering in his silence. But the more they mocked humanity, the more he could feel the pressure building within him. The Dracarians, assuming their superiority was unchallenged, took every opportunity to insult human achievements, often disguising it as playful banter. During one meeting, they openly mocked Earth's history. "You know, humans fought wars for hundreds of years, all over petty differences," Zoreth said, as he paced around the table, a smug smile on his face. "Your species is nothing but a collection of violent, bickering tribes. How do you expect to survive in space when you can't even live in peace on your own planet?" The other Dracarians laughed, their voices cold and mocking. Ethan didn't flinch. He remained silent, keeping his eyes down. On the surface, he appeared unaffected, but deep inside, he could feel something stirring, a mix of frustration and anger. He had heard these kinds of insults before, on Earth, from enemies, from people who underestimated humanity. But on this alien world, the jokes felt different. They felt personal. Later that day, during a tour of the city, Ethan overheard two Dracarian officials speaking among themselves. Their words were not meant for his ears, but the way they laughed, thinking he was out of earshot, made it clear they had no respect for him or humans. "You see, we've won already," one of the officials, Calthor, whispered to the other. "This human believes he's part of some grand cosmic exchange. He doesn't even realize how insignificant his species is." The second official, Therek, snickered. "Yes, let him continue to play his part in our little charade. His kind will never amount to anything." Ethan had heard enough. He stopped in his tracks and let them finish, then turned slowly, looking at them both with cold eyes. "I can hear you," he said calmly, his voice steady, though the muscles in his jaw tightened. "And while you may believe you're in control here, I wouldn't be so sure. You underestimate humans, and you'll regret it." Calthor and Theric exchanged surprised glances but said nothing. They clearly hadn't expected such a response. Ethan wasn't the kind of person to show his emotions easily, but these constant insults were testing his limits. He had been trained to be diplomatic, to maintain peace, to rise above petty squabbles. But this was different. These weren't just insults. They were challenges, tests of human worth. The Dracarians had underestimated him, and worse, they had underestimated humanity. The next day, during an official meeting with the Dracarian Council, things escalated further. The Council, which consisted of the galaxy's most powerful leaders, decided to test Ethan in front of an audience. The council hall was massive, filled with towering figures of alien species that Ethan had never seen before. The air was thick with tension, and the eyes of the council were fixed on him. Zorath, standing at the front, leaned forward with a sly grin. "Captain Blake," he began, his voice laced with mockery. "We've heard much about your species' technology, but I must say, I'm still baffled. You have weapons, yet your ships are no match for the Dracarian fleet. How did your kind even make it to space?" The room erupted into laughter, and for the first time, Ethan felt something inside him stir. It was a familiar feeling, one that had simmered on Earth for years. He had experienced it in the past when people doubted humanity's potential, when they saw humans as weak, primitive, and insignificant. This time, however, the feeling was different. This time, it wasn't just about defending Earth's honor. It was about showing the Dracarians that they had miscalculated. Ethan took a deep breath and looked around the room, his eyes cold and calculating. "It's not about the tools you have," he said, his voice calm but firm, "but how you use them. Humans have always fought with what we've got, and we've always found a way to survive. You can laugh all you want, but you're underestimating us, and that's a mistake you'll regret." There was a moment of silence as the Dracarians exchanged uneasy glances. They had never met anyone who spoke so boldly in their presence. The laughter stopped, but the mocking smiles didn't fade. Zorath, however, seemed intrigued. He didn't understand how a species like humanity could possess such quiet confidence. "You're a strange one, Captain," Zorath said, his voice more serious now. "Perhaps you'll prove more useful than we thought. But understand this. Your species has no place here. We will decide your fate." Ethan didn't respond. He knew what they were doing. They were trying to break him, to make him react emotionally, to show that humans were nothing but an easily broken species. But he refused to give them that satisfaction. As the meeting ended and Ethan walked through the corridors of the Dracarian palace, his thoughts were clouded with frustration. Every word, every insult felt like a slap in the face, yet he stayed silent. The pressure was building within him, the anger he kept bottled up threatening to boil over, but he knew he couldn't let it happen. He had to keep his composure, to remain the calm diplomat. However, deep down, Ethan knew one thing for sure. Humans were not the weak, primitive species the Dracarians thought they were. There was something inside them, something resilient, something fierce, that could never be snuffed out. And sooner or later, the Dracarians would learn that underestimating humanity was the biggest mistake they could make. As the days passed, the insults and tests continued, but Ethan held his ground. The Dracarians might think they were in control, but they were walking a fine line. And every time they crossed it, the more Ethan felt the urge to prove them wrong. It was only a matter of time before the Dracarians would see exactly why every species in the galaxy feared the moment when a human said, "Now I'm actually getting annoyed." The days dragged on, each one filled with more subtle insults, more pointed mockery, and more attempts to belittle humanity. Captain Ethan Blake could feel his patience slipping, but he maintained his composure. He had been trained for this, for diplomacy, for patience, for quiet strength in the face of adversity. He had dealt with difficult negotiations on Earth, where people underestimated humanity. But this was different. The Dracarians were playing a dangerous game, and every slight, every joke, Every insult pushed him closer to the edge. He knew that eventually, something would have to give. It wasn't just the insults about Earth's history or its technological limitations. It wasn't even the mocking glances or the laughter behind his back. It was the constant assumption that humanity was weak, that humans were just a species trying to catch up, struggling to survive. The Dracarians had underestimated something far more important: human resilience, determination, and the will to fight when cornered. The moment was coming, Ethan could feel it. The pressure had been building, and it was only a matter of time before the dam broke. That moment came sooner than he expected. The Dracarians had invited Ethan to a ceremonial dinner, a grand affair held in their palace, where they presented him with the highest honors they could muster. Ethan didn't expect much. He knew this was just another attempt to make him feel small, to show him how insignificant humanity was in the grand scheme of things. But what happened next pushed him past his breaking point. As the dinner progressed, Zorath, the Dracarian leader, stood up to make a toast. The other Dracarians followed suit, raising their glasses in the air with a mockingly serious tone. "To humanity," Zorath said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and arrogance. "May your species survive long enough to see the stars." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled insult. The room erupted into laughter, and the Dracarians looked at Ethan, expecting him to laugh along, to show humility, to understand his place. But Ethan didn't laugh. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, his calm facade began to crack. He stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving Zorath's face. The other Dracarians fell silent, sensing the shift in the room. Ethan's eyes burned with a cold intensity, and his voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "Enough," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "I've had enough of your mockery, your insults, your belief that you can break me." Zorath stared at him, momentarily taken aback. The rest of the council shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not the reaction they had anticipated. Ethan took a step forward, his voice rising just enough to make sure everyone could hear. "You think that because you're older, more advanced, that gives you the right to look down on humanity. But let me tell you something. Humans don't need to be the most powerful in the room to be the most dangerous. Underestimating us is a mistake you will regret." The tension in the room was palpable. For the first time, the Dracarians saw a side of Ethan they hadn't expected. It wasn't anger, though it was clear there was a fire burning inside him. It wasn't rage, though his words carried weight. It was something far more dangerous, a quiet, steely determination. The kind of determination that had allowed humanity to survive against all odds, time and time again. Zorath, trying to regain control of the situation, chuckled nervously, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Calm yourself, human," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're out of your league. We're not the ones who should be afraid." Ethan took a deep breath, and then, without breaking eye contact, said the words that would forever change the course of the meeting, and perhaps the fate of the galaxy. "Now, I'm actually getting annoyed." The room fell completely silent. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a warning. The Dracarians had heard of the legendary temper of humans before, but they had never witnessed it firsthand. They had always assumed that human anger was nothing more than a fleeting, petty emotion, easily dismissed. They were wrong. Ethan's calmness was a shield, and they had shattered it. And that was the moment they would regret. Without another word, Ethan moved swiftly. He activated a simple device hidden beneath his jacket, a communication relay he had designed to create interference in the palace's advanced security system. It wasn't advanced tech, nothing like what the Dracarians used, but it was enough to cause chaos. The lights flickered and went out, and the walls of the grand hall hummed as the Dracarian security systems began to fail. Ethan, in the darkness, moved with purpose. The Dracarians panicked, scrambling to regain control of their technology. Ethan had disabled their monitoring systems and hacked into their network with nothing more than his wit, his knowledge of basic technology, and the determination to show them that humanity's strength wasn't in its weapons, it was in its resourcefulness. He took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "You see," he said, "it's not about having the most advanced technology. It's about using what you have to your advantage. That's something you'll never understand." The Dracarians were stunned. Their advanced systems had been outsmarted by a human using nothing but basic tools. Zorath, furious and humiliated, stood up, his fists clenched. But before he could react, Ethan raised his hand, signaling for silence. "You can't intimidate me," Ethan continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had endured more than most could imagine. "You think because you're technologically superior, you control the galaxy. But the truth is, you've forgotten something essential. You've forgotten what it means to survive, to adapt, to push forward when everything seems impossible. That's what makes humans dangerous. And that's why you'll regret ever underestimating us." The Dracarians stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. The air was thick with tension, and for the first time, they realized just how dangerous Captain Ethan Blake was. Not because of his weapons, not because of his ship, but because of the quiet, unshakable will that drove him, and humanity, forward. Ethan's words echoed in the silence that followed. Underestimating humans isn't just a mistake. It's the biggest mistake you could make. With that, he turned on his heel and began to walk out of the room, leaving the Dracarians stunned and unsure of what to do next. The message had been sent. Humans might not be the most powerful species in the galaxy, but they were far from weak. And the Dracarians would soon learn that the moment a human said, "Now I'm actually getting annoyed," it was time for every other species to start worrying. The once imposing Dracarian palace was now descending into complete chaos. Explosions rumbled through its walls, and the dim lighting flickered as emergency systems struggled to regain control. For a brief moment, Zorath stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. His empire, the mighty Dracarian Empire, was crumbling before him. And it was all because of one human. Captain Ethan Blake, now freed from the confines of his cell, moved swiftly through the corridors. He had anticipated this. He had planned for this. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a strategist, a survivor. The Dracarians had thought they could break him. But now they were learning that humans had an uncanny ability to turn the tables in their favor. Ethan didn't need advanced technology to defeat them. No, he had something far more dangerous. His mind, his resourcefulness, and the human will to fight back when pushed to the edge. As the Dracarian palace crumbled under the assault of the galaxy's unexpected response to their reign, Ethan was one step ahead, guiding the chaos with precision. The Dracarians, disoriented by the constant explosions, were scrambling to regain control. But it was too late. Ethan had disabled their central communication hub earlier, causing widespread confusion. Their once impenetrable security systems had been hacked, their defenses breached. What they failed to realize was that it wasn't just about the attack. It was about the message. A message that no one in the galaxy could ignore. Ethan reached the heart of the palace, the command center where Zorath and his closest officers were struggling to contain the situation. It was there that the final confrontation would unfold. As he approached the massive reinforced doors, he took a breath, preparing himself. The next few moments would decide everything. Inside, Zorath and his generals were shouting orders, their voices frantic. The once proud leaders of the Dracarian Empire were now reduced to desperate commanders trying to save a sinking ship, but Ethan wasn't interested in saving them. He was here to send a message to the entire galaxy, a message that would resonate for years to come. The doors to the command center slid open, and Ethan stepped into the room, his presence commanding attention. The chaos in the room momentarily ceased as everyone turned to face him. Zorath, his expression twisted in anger, stepped forward. "You again," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You've cost us everything. Your species has no place in this galaxy. You'll never stand against us." Ethan stood tall, unmoving, his eyes locked on Zorath's. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the cold resolve of a man who had been pushed to his limit. He spoke slowly, but every word carried weight. "You're wrong, Zoreth. You never understood humans. You thought we were weak, unimportant. But you're about to learn that underestimating us is the worst mistake you could make." Zoreth's face twisted in disbelief. "You think you've won? Look around you. We still have power. We still control the galaxy's greatest fleets. You're nothing." Ethan's eyes never wavered. "You're right. You still have power. You still control fleets. But you don't control the spirit of humanity. And that's what makes us dangerous." The room went silent as Ethan's words echoed through the command center. Zoreth, enraged, opened his mouth to retaliate, but Ethan continued, his voice unwavering. "You may have destroyed entire civilizations, wiped out planets, and conquered countless worlds, but you've never faced humanity when we're truly pushed to our breaking point. You've never faced us when we're fighting for our survival." Zoreth's guards started to shift nervously, sensing that the tide was beginning to turn. Ethan didn't even need to look at them. He knew what they were feeling. The same thing they had always underestimated in humans. Fear. "Do you know why?" Ethan asked, his voice low and cold. "Because we don't back down. We never have. And no matter how hard you try to break us, no matter how many times you think you've beaten us, we always rise. Every single time." A tense silence filled the room. The Dracarians, once so confident in their superiority, now found themselves questioning everything. They had thought themselves invincible, but now, with the balance of power shifting, they realized that humanity wasn't just a blip on the galactic radar. Humans were a force to be reckoned with. Suddenly, an explosion shook the walls again, sending tremors through the floor. Ethan remained steady, his eyes fixed on Zoreth. "It's over, Zoreth," Ethan said calmly. "Your empire is crumbling, and you have no one but yourselves to blame. Humanity won't be your pawn any longer. We won't be the species you mock or take for granted. We're not the weak ones. We never were." Zoreth's face twisted into a snarl, and he reached for his weapon. But before he could draw it, the room was plunged into darkness. The emergency systems failed completely this time. Nothing worked. No lights, no communications, no power. It was as if the palace had been abandoned by its own technology. Zoreth stumbled back, his eyes wide with panic. He had no idea how this was happening. Ethan's device had done its job. The Dracarians were in the dark, literally and figuratively. "Now," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the thick silence, "you'll finally understand. No matter how advanced your technology is, no matter how many ships you command, it means nothing without the will to fight." Zoreth's voice trembled with fury. "You think this changes anything? You think this rebellion will stop us? We are the Dracarians. We are invincible." Ethan took a step closer. "Not anymore." With that, he activated another device, hidden in his jacket. This one wasn't just a communication jammer. It was a signal that would send a message to every corner of the galaxy, a signal that humanity was no longer afraid, no longer willing to kneel to anyone. As the device hummed to life, a faint glow illuminated the room for just a moment, then faded to black. But the signal had been sent, and it would reach every corner of the galaxy. Wherever there was a human, they would know. Humanity was no longer weak. Zoreth's eyes widened as he felt the weight of his mistake. This wasn't just a rebellion. It was the beginning of something far greater. The Dracarians had underestimated humanity, and now they were about to pay the price. But Ethan wasn't there to watch them fall. He had done his part. He had sent the message, and as he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the Dracarians to face the consequences of their arrogance, he knew that humanity would never be seen as weak again. The galaxy had just witnessed the true power of humans, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence after Ethan's departure from the command center was deafening. The Dracarians, still reeling from the chaos, and the sudden failure of their technology stood frozen. Zoreth's face was a mixture of rage and disbelief, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for answers that were no longer there. The Empire, which had once seemed untouchable, now felt fragile, like a fragile shell about to shatter. Zoreth's fist clenched tightly, his knuckles white. "Find him," he barked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "He can't escape. We'll make an example of him. He has no idea what he started." But as the Drakarian officers scrambled to restore order, they couldn't ignore the truth. The truth that Ethan Blake, the human they had considered so insignificant, had just orchestrated a shift in power so profound, it threatened to unravel everything they had built. The galaxy had witnessed the spark of human defiance, and now the fires were beginning to spread. Outside, the Drakarian palace was a war zone. Their once pristine city was now a chaotic battleground, with their defenses crippled and the air thick with the sound of explosions. The galaxy-wide signal Ethan had triggered was reverberating across systems, and every species, every empire, was beginning to feel it. The message was clear: humanity would no longer be oppressed. Back in the heart of the crumbling palace, Zoreth turned to his commanders, his face grim. "We need to act quickly. If this message spreads, if the other species begin to rally around humanity, we're finished." But deep down, Zoreth knew the truth. The Drakarian Empire's time was running out. Their arrogance, their overconfidence in their superior technology and military strength, had led them to underestimate the humans. Now that very underestimation had set off a chain of events that even Zoreth couldn't control. Meanwhile, Ethan was moving through the palace's abandoned hallways. The alarms were still blaring, the walls rattling with the reverberations of the destruction outside. He didn't need to see the damage to know the extent of the chaos. He had done his part. The message had been sent, the signal was out, and the Drakarians would have to answer for their underestimation of humanity. But as Ethan walked, his thoughts didn't dwell on victory or the future of the Drakarians. His mind was already focused on the next step. This wasn't just about revenge or defiance. It was about survival. Humanity's survival. The message he had sent wasn't just a declaration of war. It was a call to arms, a rallying cry for every species that had been oppressed or exploited. Humanity had proven its strength, and now others would take notice. The galaxy was about to see what it meant when humans united. As Ethan stepped into the central control room of the palace, he found it eerily empty. The once bustling hub of Drakarian leadership was now deserted, save for the scattered equipment and the occasional flash of sparks from broken consoles. It was here that Ethan paused for a moment, the weight of the moment settling over him. This was where it all had started, where the Drakarians had believed they could break him, subjugate humanity. And now, it was here that the Empire would feel the full force of human resilience. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved to the central control console, his fingers dancing over the interface with practiced ease. The palace's systems had been compromised before, but now he had one final message to deliver, something that would mark the end of the Drakarians' reign. His fingers pressed a few final keys, and the entire palace's communication systems lit up, projecting a holographic message. It wasn't just a simple warning or threat. It was a declaration, a final act of defiance. The message that flashed on the holographic screen read, "The galaxy is not yours to conquer. Humanity is not yours to control. We are no longer your pawns. You have underestimated us. And now, the fight begins." As the message flickered into place, Ethan took a step back. He didn't need to say anything else. The words on the screen would do the talking. The entire Drakarian palace, and the galaxy itself, would know that this was just the beginning. Zoreth, still attempting to regain control from the command center, watched as the message flashed across his own consoles. His face turned pale. It was the final blow. The Drakarians had always prided themselves on their technological superiority, their ability to silence and control. But now, they were facing something they couldn't control. A human who had turned their own system against them. A species they had thought of as nothing more than a nuisance. Zorath slammed his fist against the console in frustration. "This isn't over," he growled. "We will crush them. All of them." But deep inside he knew. The Drakarian's empire was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The tide of power was shifting, and humanity was at the forefront of this new era. The Drakarians might try to fight back, but the world they had built was coming apart at the seams. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, species of every kind were receiving the message. The words had already spread like wildfire, and humanity's defiance was taking root. The galaxy had never seen anything like it before. Species that had long been subjugated, races that had been oppressed for centuries, now saw a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone anymore, and they weren't powerless. The true strength of humanity wasn't in its weapons, its technology, or its vast fleets. No, the true strength of humanity was in its will, its unyielding desire to survive, to fight, and to rise against impossible odds. And now, the galaxy was waking up to that truth. As Ethan Blake stood in the control room, watching the Drakarian Empire teeter on the edge of collapse, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the future of humanity. The future of every species that had ever been oppressed or looked down upon. The battle had only just begun, and Ethan Blake was ready. The message had been sent. And now, the galaxy would learn what it truly meant to face humanity's wrath.